1944, the Pacific War raged on with unrelenting fury. Cities burned, soldiers fought to exhaustion, and the world stood on the edge of collapse. But far from the front lines, behind guarded fences and barbed wire, another story was quietly unfolding. A story few could have imagined in the chaos of war. Among the prisoners of war captured by American forces were Japanese women, nurses, civilians, and aid workers swept into the tide of conflict. They arrived weary, their spirits battered by hardship and uncertainty. For weeks, months, sometimes years, they had endured squalid conditions, scarcity of food, exposure to disease, and an absence of even the most basic human comforts. Their survival had been measured not in luxuries, but in the will to endure another day, and then came the moment that would remain etched in their memories forever. Inside the guarded gates of an American POW camp, they were led into a building unlike any they had seen in captivity. Pipes hissed, water flowed, and steam curled into the air. It was not a weapon, not an interrogation, not another deprivation. It was a shower, hot water cascading down in abundance. For women who had gone so long without the simplest comforts of cleanliness, the shock of warmth was overwhelming. Some wept, others stood frozen, and a few reached out in disbelief, their hands trembling under the miracle of heated water. In that instant, surrounded by concrete walls and the roar of water, the cruelty of war seemed distant. For the first time in months, maybe years, they felt human again. The first time the Japanese women POWs were led toward the American shower facility, the air around them was thick with silence. It was late afternoon, the sun hanging low beyond the fences, its golden light casting long shadows across the gravel paths of the camp. The women walked in a small group, their steps hesitant, guarded by soldiers whose faces betrayed neither cruelty nor warmth. To these women, every moment in captivity was unpredictable, and this, being escorted toward a building they had not seen before, was no different. Whispers passed between them. Brief glances exchanged, the language of uncertainty flowing in half-formed murmurs. What awaited them inside those walls? From the outside, the building appeared plain, constructed of sturdy concrete, its roof low and unadorned. It bore none of the signs of punishment or interrogation they had learned to dread. No chairs bolted to the floor, no bright lamps for questioning, no sound of boots echoing through a corridor. Instead, faint wisps of steam curled through narrow vents, vanishing into the cooling air. That sight alone gave pause. Steam meant water, and water meant washing. But could it be possible? Could it be true that within those walls there existed the simple luxury of cleanliness? The door creaked open under the hand of a guard, and the women stepped inside. The sound that greeted them was unfamiliar. The hiss of pipes, the steady drip of water, the hollow echo of droplets striking the floor. The interior was brighter than they expected, lit by a row of electric bulbs strung along the ceiling. Their eyes widened as they took in the sight before them. The floor was tiled, pale and shining with moisture. Along the walls, silver pipes ran in neat, orderly lines, branching into rows of faucets and shower heads. It was nothing like the crude buckets of stagnant water they had grown accustomed to in the chaos of war. No mud, no rust, no bitter stench of disease. Here everything seemed clean, sterile, impossibly modern. For a moment no one moved. The prisoners stood frozen, their thin clothing clinging to their weary bodies, their hair tangled and skin marked by weeks of hardship. They stared at the faucets as though they were some kind of illusion, a mirage conjured in the desert of deprivation. One woman, perhaps braver or simply more desperate than the others, stepped closer. She extended a tentative hand toward the metal handle, her fingers trembling. But she stopped short, turning her eyes toward the guards, unsure if this was allowed or if the moment of contact would bring swift punishment. The guards did not interfere. One of them merely nodded, his hand resting casually on the strap of his rifle. It was not a gesture of cruelty, nor one of kindness, just an acknowledgement that this was permitted. Slowly, the woman turned the handle. A burst of water sprayed forth, striking the floor with a sharp hiss. She gasped, stumbling back, the shock of sound and motion too sudden, too overwhelming. But then the steam rose, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of warmth and soap. Hot water, not cold, not tepid, not the filthy trickle they had come to expect in makeshift baths. Real heated water. The others drew closer, their eyes wide. They touched the flowing stream hesitantly, as though fearing it might burn them. Instead, it wrapped around their skin like a forgotten memory, a sensation so distant they struggled to recall the last time they had felt it. Weeks, months, For some, perhaps years, their silence deepened, broken only by the sound of water striking tile. A kind of reverence filled the air, a sacredness born not of temples or shrines, but of something far more primal, the chance to be clean, to be human again. One by one, they began to understand. This was not punishment. This was not interrogation. This was an invitation, an act so simple yet so profound it was almost impossible to believe. They were prisoners, captives of an enemy who had destroyed their cities, separated them from their families, and placed them behind barbed wire. And yet, here was an offering of dignity, something even many free civilians had gone without during the chaos of war. As they stepped further into the room, the women's footsteps echoed softly against the tile. The warmth of the air enveloped them, beads of condensation forming on their skin. Some exchanged glances, unsure if they should remove their clothes, still carrying the shame of exposure in a foreign land. But the need outweighed the fear. Slowly, carefully, garments were folded and placed on benches against the walls. Their frail bodies, marked by fatigue and hunger, bore the stories of captivity. But soon, those stories would be washed in water that carried both shock and healing. The first streams splashed across their backs, their arms, their faces. The water carried away layers of dust and sweat, revealing skin that had forgotten the feeling of softness. Some closed their eyes tightly, standing rigid as the warmth embraced them. Others leaned into it, tilting their heads back, mouths open, as if to drink the very sensation of heat. The water became more than a cleansing. It became a memory revived, a connection to a life they once knew before war had stripped it away. Laughter, hesitant at first, began to ripple through the room. It was not loud, not boisterous, but it was laughter nonetheless, fragile, disbelieving, almost childlike. One woman pressed her hands against the streams, then wiped them across her face again and again, as though afraid the miracle might vanish if she stopped. Another whispered something in Japanese, her voice trembling with both awe and gratitude. The others nodded silently, too overwhelmed for words. The guards remained at the doorway, watching without expression. Perhaps they had seen this moment before, with other groups of prisoners. Perhaps they understood the significance, or perhaps they regarded it as routine. But to the women standing beneath the streams, it was anything but routine. This was deliverance in its smallest, most ordinary form. What made the showers extraordinary was not their construction, the pipes, the tiles, the soap, but the timing. At a moment when these women had been reduced to numbers, stripped of freedom, and weighed down by despair, they were suddenly reminded of their humanity. In the hiss of hot water, in the rising steam, in the cleansing sensation rushing over their tired bodies, they discovered a paradox, that compassion could exist even inside the walls of captivity. And so, what began as hesitation at a doorway transformed into something profound. They entered uncertain, wary of trickery. But as they emerged, their eyes glistened not with fear, but with something closer to hope. The showers were not a luxury they would ever forget. They were a memory, etched permanently into the chapters of their survival. The moment the first drops of hot water touched their skin, it was as if an electric current ran through the bodies of the Japanese women POWs. For years, their lives had been dictated by deprivation, cold baths, if any at all, in rivers or crude basins, water drawn hastily and shared by many, often contaminated and unfit for use. Even before their capture, during the long marches and exhausting voyages of war, cleanliness had been an afterthought, survival the only priority. And yet, here in the unfamiliar setting of an American prisoner of war camp, a simple act of bathing had become something overwhelming, even unimaginable. The warmth was not just physical, it struck deep into their memories. For many, the sensation instantly transported them back to homes that seemed a world away. They remembered village bathhouses filled with laughter, the sound of mothers calling to children, the comfort of ritual after a long day's work. They remembered the steam rising over wooden tubs in quiet courtyards where cleanliness was not only necessity, but tradition. And now, standing naked and vulnerable beneath foreign-built pipes, they found those memories colliding with the present in a way so sharp that some women began to cry. Their sobs echoed softly in the chamber, mingling with the hiss of water and the drip of steam-soaked pipes. Tears and water became indistinguishable. A woman pressed her palms against her face, wiping away layers of dirt that clung stubbornly to her skin, as though washing away months of humiliation. Another tilted her head back, letting the hot water cascade over her hair, her body trembling not from cold, but from the force of relief. To feel clean again, to feel warm, was to feel alive, and it was this realization that shattered their composure. Some women wept openly, not caring who saw, while others broke into sudden, almost nervous laughter. The sound was startling in such a place, a camp defined by rules, watchtowers, and fences. Yet in that laughter was release, an unshackling of emotions buried too long. For the guards at the door, this scene may have seemed ordinary. They had seen prisoners washed before. They had seen groups led in, nervous and hesitant, and they had seen them emerge calmer, restored. But for the women themselves, this was no routine. The difference between cold, rationed water poured into buckets and this abundance of flowing, heated water was immeasurable. It was the difference between survival and dignity. The physical transformation was immediate. Streaks of dirt ran in rivulets down their bodies, swirling into the drains below. Hair once matted with sweat and grime loosened, shining again under the droplets. Skin, roughened by sun and neglect, softened beneath the soothing streams. Yet what occurred internally was even more profound. In those moments, the women were no longer simply captives. They were individuals reclaiming fragments of themselves, fragments stolen by war, hunger, and displacement. Some whispered prayers as the water fell over them. Others murmured to one another, their voices hushed and reverent, as though afraid to break the sanctity of the experience. A few clutched bars of soap, turning them over in disbelief before lathering up, watching the foam gather and fall away. Soap itself had become a rarity, a treasure worth trading or hoarding in the darker corners of captivity. To hold it freely now felt like another miracle, one layered upon the gift of heat and cleanliness. The paradox of it all lingered in their minds. Here they were, in the custody of the very enemy they had been raised to fear, their nation's sworn adversary. And yet, these showers offered something more than what some had received even in their own villages before the war. The Americans had provided what their own country, amidst chaos and shortages, could not. Water in abundance, heated and clean, flowing as if from an endless spring. It was difficult to reconcile, and perhaps that was why the emotions ran so raw. The women could not ignore the brutality of war, nor the fences outside these walls. But inside this chamber of water and steam, they could not deny the unexpected humanity they were being shown. The soundscape of the room told its own story. At first silence had hung heavy. Then came the hiss of pipes, the sharp bursts of streams hitting the floor. Soon after, muffled cries. And now the chamber was filled with a new rhythm. Laughter, weeping, and the steady cadence of rushing water like rain upon stone. It was a chorus of release, of burdens washing away. For each woman, the shower meant something personal, a return to childhood memory, a symbol of dignity, a rare moment of peace. Together, these individual experiences created an atmosphere that transcended captivity. As the minutes passed, the women began to relax. Shoulders hunched in fear loosened, backs straightened, faces softened. Some dared to linger longer beneath the streams, as though unwilling to surrender the moment. They rubbed their arms, their faces, their legs, with almost frantic determination, as though by scrubbing hard enough they could erase every trace of suffering, every mark of hardship the war had etched upon their skin. For them, the water was not simply cleansing. It was erasure, renewal, resurrection. One prisoner, older than the rest, let out a laugh that startled those around her. It was not mocking or bitter, but filled with a childlike joy. She spread her arms wide, tilting her face upward, eyes closed, allowing the water to pour over her as if she were embracing the heavens themselves. Those nearby could not help but smile, their own laughter joining hers. In that instant, the boundaries of rank, age, and circumstance dissolved. They were no longer defined by their roles in the war, nor by the labels of captor and captive. They were simply women rediscovering the luxury of being alive. For some, disbelief lingered. Could this generosity last? Would it be taken from them as suddenly as it had been given? Fear still clung at the edges of their minds, whispering that this could be temporary, that cruelty might follow kindness, as it so often did in war. But for now, they allowed themselves to surrender. To the heat, to the steam, to the feeling of skin once again alive under the touch of water. When the showers finally ceased, the silence returned, broken only by the last dripping of water from the pipes. The women stood motionless, breathing heavily, their bodies steaming in the cool air of the room. Their hair clung to their shoulders, their skin glistened with droplets, and their eyes reflected something they had not carried when they entered. A fragile spark of hope. They looked at one another, and in those glances was unspoken understanding. They had shared something transformative, something that could never be undone. They wrapped themselves in the towels provided, fabric soft against their freshly cleaned skin, and prepared to leave. Outside, the barbed wire and the guard towers waited. But within them, something had shifted. The memory of that warmth, that moment of impossible humanity would remain. For some, it would be a symbol of contradiction. For others, a beacon of survival. But for all, it would be unforgettable. The showers did far more than cleanse the bodies of the Japanese women prisoners. They carried with them an intangible power, something no ration or uniform could provide, the restoration of dignity. It was not merely about dirt being washed away, or hair becoming soft again. It was about feeling human after so many months of being reduced to something less. For in captivity, the women had been treated as numbers, as enemy, as anonymous figures herded behind fences. But when they stepped out of those steaming chambers wrapped in clean towels, they were no longer just prisoners. They were individuals, women who remembered who they had been before war had stolen that memory. The feeling was disorienting. Many of them had braced themselves for cruelty when captured. They had expected humiliation, perhaps even violence, and had steeled their minds against such possibilities. To receive kindness or something resembling it was far more difficult to process. Their hearts and minds struggled to reconcile two truths, that they were captives of an enemy who had shattered their homeland, and yet, in this strange corner of war, those same enemies had given them something precious, something deeply personal. The contradiction was almost unbearable. Wrapped in towels, they moved quietly through the corridors of the camp building. The sound of their footsteps softened by the fabric beneath their feet. Their hair, damp and heavy, clung to their shoulders. Droplets rolled down their arms, leaving trails that disappeared into the towels. Each woman carried the scent of soap, faint yet unmistakable, a fragrance that filled the air with a reminder of civilization. That scent alone seemed to whisper, "You are more than a prisoner, more than a victim of war." It was in their eyes that the transformation became most visible. Before, their gazes had been dulled by fatigue, clouded by despair. But now, glimmers of light flickered within them. Some looked at their companions and smiled faintly, their lips trembling as though unused to such an expression. Others pressed their towels closer, cherishing the rare softness against their skin. Small gestures, almost invisible to an observer, became monumental in meaning. A tilt of the head, a faint chuckle, a hand brushing damp hair from a face. Each action was a quiet rebellion against the dehumanization of captivity. One woman, younger than most, reached out to another and squeezed her hand gently. The gesture was simple, but in that touch was gratitude, solidarity, and the unspoken acknowledgement that they had survived something together. The showers had not erased their suffering, but they had created a shared moment of reprieve, a memory that bound them closer. In a camp where days blurred together in monotony and fear, this moment stood out as a reminder that humanity had not been entirely extinguished by war. The act of being clean carried with it an almost spiritual weight. In Japanese tradition, bathing was more than physical. It was purification, a ritual of renewal. The women carried those traditions deep within their hearts, even if far from home. Emerging from the showers, wrapped in towels, many felt as though they had been cleansed not only of dirt, but of shame, fear, and despair that had clung to them. For a brief span of time, they could look at themselves and see not prisoners, but women who still carried worth. The atmosphere between them shifted. Before, their conversations had been hushed, spoken in tones of anxiety or fatigue. Now their voices carried a softness, almost melodic. They exchanged quiet remarks, not about war or suffering, but about the sensation of warmth, about the faint memory of bathhouses in their villages, about the simple relief of no longer feeling coated in grime. One woman even whispered about her mother's bath at home, remembering the way steam had risen in the evenings, curling into the night sky. Her words stirred memories in others, and soon a chain of recollections passed through the group, weaving their minds back to a life they feared lost forever. The guards, who escorted them back to their quarters, noticed the change. Though their faces remained impassive, though their rifles still rested at their sides, they could not ignore the subtle difference in the way the prisoners carried themselves. Shoulders that had sagged now straightened, steps that had dragged now moved with faint energy. The women seemed lighter, as though something invisible had been lifted from them. Even without understanding the cultural depth of bathing, the Americans could see the effect. The showers had given these prisoners something rare and valuable, a sense of self-restored. It was not a grand transformation, not the sudden end of despair. Hunger still gnawed at their stomachs. The fences and towers still loomed outside, reminding them of the limits of their freedom. War still thundered on beyond the camp, yet within their hearts there was a subtle shift. For the first time in many months, they felt clean. For the first time, they looked at one another and saw not just weary captives, but fellow women carrying fragments of grace. The towels themselves became symbols. Worn though they were, ordinary to the Americans, to the prisoners they felt luxurious, soft against skin that had known only roughness. Many clutched them close, as if afraid they might be taken away. For some, the towel became almost sacred, a piece of cloth that represented the fleeting kindness they had received. A few women would later fold theirs carefully, keeping them as tokens of this day, reminders that dignity could survive even in captivity. There were those who remained skeptical. Not every woman embraced the experience with open gratitude. Some, hardened by suspicion, wondered if this comfort was meant to manipulate, to weaken their resolve. They whispered to one another in quiet corners, "Why would the enemy give us such a gift? What does it mean?" But even these doubts could not fully diminish the effect. The warmth of the water, the softness of the towels, the scent of soap, they lingered on their bodies. Undeniable truths that could not be dismissed, no matter the suspicion. Later, as they lay in their barracks, the women touched their hair, running fingers through strands now smooth and untangled. They smelled the faint fragrance of soap still clinging to their skin. The memory of the shower replayed again and again in their minds. The shock of heat, the rush of emotion, the way tears had fallen freely, mingling with water. For many, it was the first moment since their capture that they allowed themselves to close their eyes and remember who they had once been before war. Daughters, sisters, wives, friends. Women who had lived ordinary lives, filled with rituals of cleanliness, laughter, and dignity. And so, the showers became something more than hygiene. Outside, the harsh gravel paths, the cutting wind, the sternness of military order. Inside, the hiss of water, the rise of steam, the promise of feeling alive. For many, the showers became a kind of paradox, an emotional contradiction they carried heavily in their hearts. How could such comfort exist in the middle of a prison camp? How could those who were their captors, those whose forces had destroyed their homes and cities, also give them something so gentle, so deeply human? The contradiction gnawed at them, but most chose to simply accept the gift. Survival demanded it. To deny themselves this relief would have been another form of punishment, and they had endured enough. In time, the ritual began to shape the rhythm of life in the camp. Days were counted not only by meals and roll calls, but by the opportunities to step into the showers. For some women, it became a goal to endure through the hardships of the week, to push past hunger, to push past despair, because they knew that eventually the showers would come again. The warmth was fleeting, but its memory lingered, like a lantern flickering in the dark. It was remarkable how something so ordinary outside the fences could become extraordinary within them. In homes across the world, people bathed without thought, turned on taps without wonder, used soap without reverence. But here, in the confines of captivity, such ordinary luxuries became moments of transcendence. The women spoke of them in reverent tones, as though they were blessings from some unseen source. And perhaps, in a way, they were. There was also an unspoken understanding that these showers were more than just physical relief. They were survival. They washed away more than sweat and dirt. They washed away despair. They gave the women something to anticipate, something to anchor themselves to when the days felt endless and the nights unbearable. Each droplet of hot water was a reminder that life had not yet been stripped of all comfort, that there were still fragments of mercy even in the harshness of war. The symbolism of the showers was not lost on them. They knew they were still captives, still behind barbed wire, still living under the shadow of war. The fences did not vanish, the guards did not disappear. Yet in the rising steam, in the way water rolled down their bodies, they glimpsed something that resembled freedom. It was not freedom of movement, nor freedom of choice, but freedom of spirit, a reminder that even in confinement, they were a ritual of restoration, an unspoken promise that even in the darkest corners of war, fragments of humanity could survive. The women would never forget the day they stepped out wrapped in towels, their eyes glistening, their hearts momentarily unburdened. That day they were reminded not only of who they were, but of who they still could be. Word of the showers spread through the camp like a quiet, persistent current. At first, it traveled only between the women who had experienced it, whispered in hushed tones within the dim light of their quarters. Their words were tinged with disbelief, as though speaking too loudly might break the spell and take away the gift they had been given. "Hot water," one woman whispered to another. "Soap, real soap," another added, her voice trembling. The news spread from bed to bed, barrack to barrack, until the showers became a subject of wonder, a beacon of anticipation in a world otherwise defined by monotony and despair. Soon, the showers were no longer a mystery but a ritual. The sound of the pipes hissing and the faint clouds of steam rising from the small building carried across the camp like a signal. It was as though the showers themselves called out, reminding the women that even in captivity there could be moments of reprieve. Each time the doors opened, releasing a fresh wave of warm, scented air, women waiting in line would inhale deeply, their faces lighting up with a mixture of relief and longing. The smell of soap, carried faintly on the breeze, became a scent that embodied hope. The ritual of waiting became its own experience. Women lined up quietly, sometimes clutching small cloths or personal items, their expressions filled with cautious anticipation. Behind them loomed the stark reminders of their reality, barbed wire stretched high, guard towers standing watch, rifles slung over the shoulders of silent sentries. Yet despite the ever-present weight of captivity, the line to the showers carried a different atmosphere. Here conversations flowed more freely. Women whispered about their families, about memories of home, about the small things they missed, the rustle of tatami mats, the glow of lantern light, the rhythm of ordinary days. Waiting in line for the showers gave them the rare chance to feel like themselves again, not just prisoners defined by numbers. The building itself became almost sacred. Its walls, plain and utilitarian, held within them something rare and transformative. To those who passed by without entering, the showers remained mysterious, a place of rumors and wonder. But to those who stepped inside, they were sanctuaries of warmth and renewal. The contrast was stark. Their humanity could not be erased. This paradox lingered long after they left the shower building. The memory of hot water followed them into the nights, carried in the softness of their hair, in the scent of soap that clung faintly to their skin. Some women closed their eyes at night and imagined the sound of rushing water, letting it lull them to sleep, carrying them away from the camp into dreams of home. Others woke in the early morning, touched their hair and smiled faintly, remembering the gift they had been given. For the Americans, perhaps it was simply procedure, a practical measure to maintain hygiene, to prevent disease within the camp. But for the Japanese women, it was something that transcended practicality. It was dignity restored, a ritual of survival, a fleeting taste of humanity that made the burdens of captivity slightly easier to bear. And so the showers became a paradoxical symbol in the women's lives. They stood as proof that even in war, where brutality, loss, and cruelty seemed to rule, moments of compassion could still exist. They were reminders that no matter how far humanity fell into the depths of conflict, there were always sparks of mercy to be found, sometimes in the most unexpected places.